Hi everyone, hope everything is going well this week. Today I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. There's just times where I find myself in need of a reminder that God has everything under control, and um, that He's actively working and working on our behalf too, as believers. And when I find myself in that place, I go back to the book of Daniel. So I'm gonna just read through part of that and make a few observations, and I'll probably continue through the book of Daniel for a little while, at least, I guess. But Daniel chapter 1, it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God." And before we even get into chapter 1, into the meat of it, just that little introduction, already shows that God has things under control, because here we see God's discipline on his people because they had been in disobedience to him. And, back in the time of Moses, God told them what would happen if they did not keep his commandments and if they did not follow him and if they turned to other gods. And, Habakkuk talks about the state of the nation at the time before this happened. And he said in verse 4 of chapter 1, he said, verse 3, he said, "There's strife and contention arises, therefore the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds." And he said in verse 2, "O Lord, how long shall I cry out and you will not hear, even cry out to you violence and you will not save?" I mean, Habakkuk was saying, things have gotten pretty bad here. When are you going to do something about it, God? And the Lord's reply is that he was raising up the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, to execute his discipline on his people. And that's what happened in a little bit later, at the time setting the stage for the book of Daniel. And so we see that God had this under control the whole time. And even as Babylon conquers his people, that was God's plan being worked out, and his discipline on them to bring them back to him, that he had told them was gonna happen. But my point being that this didn't catch God by surprise. He was working the whole time. And then in verse 3, then we start to get into the story of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And I think I'll just try to keep this from getting too long, but I'll read through chapter 1. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them for a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of the time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, we don't know exactly what the problem with the food was, right? It could have been unclean food, like according to the Mosaic law. It could have been something that, had first been offered to the false gods of Babylon and then brought to them. But there is something that Daniel and his friends were aware of that would cause them to sin or defile themselves if they partook of it, that it would be a violation of God's law and their conscience. And so they had purposed in their heart, and I like that, they purposed in their heart that they were not going to defile themselves. They had made the decision that they were not going to violate what God wanted from them. Now God had brought Daniel, and I like the way that again, talking about how God has this all under control and how he is actively working. And I don't think it's I don't think it's unintentional the way that this is worded. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Not it happened by chance, or Daniel was lucky that the chief of the eunuchs listened to him or was in a good mood that day. Like it says, God brought him into favor so that the chief of the eunuchs would listen to his request that he makes. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. Chief of the eunuchs says, if I don't do what the king said and make you eat this stuff, then it's my life that's at risk if you guys don't keep pace with everyone else that's in this training program for service to the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. As you see fit, so deal with your servants. Now, that would be challenging for me, right? To just say, okay, to give up meat and say, give me vegetables for 10 days. I like my meat, but 10 days isn't a lot of time, right? You can see some noticeable differences, I guess, in 10 days based on your diet. But for me, that's a pretty short period of time for something significant to happen. And eating vegetables and water only, I know if I did that for 10 days that I would probably lose weight and I don't know how that would play out for me. But at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. And I don't think that that's just coincidence either. Maybe I'm inferring a little bit here, but I think that God honored their decision to obey him, to follow him. And they were better than the rest at the end of that testing period. Thus the steward took away their portions of the delicacies and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, and again, listen to how this is worded, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. It came from God. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, so 3 years later, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. And I guess the takeaway here that right now for me, I'm just looking for reminder that God has it under control, and he really does. And at this point, Daniel and his friends, they were taken captive, taken from their land, probably from their families, and entered into this program, and God honored their desire to obey him. But God's not I'm losing track of the word, but God is not required to bless them because they chose to obey him, right? We're required to obey him because he says so. But God had a plan, and we know the rest of the story of Daniel, right? Clearly God was going to use Daniel to accomplish some things within both his nation, but also within the kingdom of Babylon. And nothing that the king had in place or did was going to keep God from being able to accomplish that. And we see a couple of things. We see God has nations and kingdoms under control. God brought Babylon in to discipline his people for their disobedience. We see that God was able to bless Daniel and his friends, and that he did. But we see that God had a plan for them, and they had to obey God, and they did, and God worked on their behalf to bring his plan about. And nothing caught him by surprise. I mean, we'll see if we keep going through the book of Daniel, we'll see even more stark examples of that, to where kings and kingdoms and rulers and people and evil and like none of it could thwart God's plan. Like he was more powerful than all of it. But we also see God intervening on behalf of here for individuals who were faithful and obedient to him. And I think that in the circumstances we're in today, like a lot of that is similar. Like it's comforting to understand that regardless of what happens politically or nationwide, that God has it under control, right? It's not catching him by surprise. We might not know exactly what that means in terms of how things play out in the short term, but we know God has it under control, and we know how things do play out long term, right? So we can take hope in that and encouragement in that. And then also it's comforting to know that God, there is plenty of example in Scripture of God acting on behalf of his people who are obediently following him, and that he is, though he's not required to, he's able to deliver us, to help us, to bless us, or whatever we may need his help with at the time. So thought for the day, hope it's encouraging, and I will see you all again next week.